Picture this. It's 1971. There's a 20-year-old and he's standing in a Dover customs office. His heart is absolutely pounding and sweat is dripping down his back. And he's terrified, completely terrified, because he's just been caught red-handed in a tax evasion scheme that could send him to prison. And this person is Richard Branson. At this moment, Richard is running Virgin Mail Order, selling discount records from a church crypt in London. But the business is hemorrhaging money. He's £15,000 in debt. He's got a £20,000 mortgage on a recording studio, and he's desperate, like genuinely desperate. So he comes up with what seems like a clever workaround. He buys records, declares them as exports to avoid purchase tax, then secretly brings them back into the UK to sell at a profit. And you know what? It works. For a while. He makes multiple trips to Dover, loading up vans with records, making enough money to almost cover Virgin's debts. But then customs officers catch on. They arrest him right there at the port. They charge him under the Customs and Excise Act, and they throw him in a jail cell for the night. The moment that could end everything before it even begins. Richard is sitting in that cell, completely alone, watching his entire future collapse. And his headmaster's words from a few years earlier, they're echoing in his mind. That infamous quote is, "You will either go to prison or become a millionaire." Right now, prison is looking like the winning bet. The next morning, his mother Eve shows up. She doesn't lecture him. She doesn't cry. Instead, she does something extraordinary. She puts up the family home as bail to get him out. Then Richard has to face the music. He agrees to pay £60,000 in penalties, 3 times the illegal profit Virgin had already made from the scheme, in installments over 3 years. And here's the thing. If he fails to pay, he goes back to jail and gets a criminal record that will destroy any chance of building a business empire. This is where our story really begins. Because what happens next is not just about one man building a bunch of companies. It's about how someone takes the absolute worst moment of their life and turns it into the foundation of everything they become. So who is this guy who almost destroyed his future before it started? And why does this story matter to you and me? Because this is the same person who built the Virgin Group into a global business encompassing over 400 companies across dozens of industries. So let's dive in. Welcome to Inflection Moments. I'm David Franklin, and you and I are about to dive into something fascinating. You know that moment when everything changes for an entrepreneur? When one decision, one pivot, one breakthrough suddenly shifts their entire trajectory. That's what we're hunting for today. If you're building something, if you're that founder grinding it out, making those impossible decisions that keep you up at night, this episode is for you. Because today, we're going inside the mind of one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history to uncover the exact moments that transformed their journey from ordinary to extraordinary. Here's what we're doing. We're dissecting the 5 most pivotal inflection points in their career, but more importantly, we're uncovering the strategic thinking behind each decision, the kind of insight that separates the builders from the dreamers. Ready? Let's get started. All right, so let's go back to 1966. I want you to imagine that you're 16 years old. You're sitting in a stiff, dusty classroom at Stowe, a middle-class, posh, traditional British boarding school, and you are miserable because for Richard Branson, school isn't just boring, it is a daily humiliation. We have to start here because this context explains everything that follows. Richard has severe dyslexia, but, and this is critical, it hasn't been diagnosed yet. Nobody in the 60s really understands what dyslexia is. So his teachers don't look at him and see a kid with a learning difficulty. They look at him and see a kid who's lazy, who's slow, who's essentially stupid. In Richard's autobiography, Losing My Virginity, there's a detail that really sticks with me. He describes looking at the blackboard during lessons and just sees letters swimming around, refusing to form words, making absolutely no sense. He feels completely locked out of the academic world. There's another moment he talks about where when he's 8 years old, he's forced to take an IQ test. And when asked about it later, he says with this painful honesty, "I don't think I filled in anything." So you have this kid, he can't read well, he can't spell, The traditional path to success, exams, university, a stable job, that door is slammed shut in his face. He knows it, and his teachers know it. But here's where the story really begins, in my opinion. And this is the first glimpse we get of Richard's superpowers. While he's struggling to decode the words on a chalkboard, his mind is doing something else entirely. He isn't focusing on the details because he can't. Instead, he's looking at the big picture. He's connecting dots that other people, the smart kids with the high IQs, are completely missing. Because he's sitting there at Stowe and he's staring out the window at the world in 1966, and the world is on fire. Think about it. You've got the Vietnam War raging. You've got the civil rights movement in America. You've got the Beatles changing music. You've got the sexual revolution. The culture is exploding. And then he looks down at the school magazine on his desk. And what is it? It's boring. It's stale. It's full of cricket scores and polite essays about school events that nobody cares about. And Richard feels this massive disconnect. He's thinking, wait a minute, there's a revolution happening outside these walls, and nobody in here is talking about it. So Richard sees this gap, a massive gap between what young people care about and what they're being fed by the establishment. So getting inside Richard's head for a moment, he wants to start a magazine. So he teams up with his best friend, Nick Powell, and they come up with this idea for a publication called Student. But you and I know it's not just about a magazine. Deep down, what Richard really wants is redemption. He wants to prove that he's not the dumb kid in the back of the class. He wants to prove that the teachers who dismissed him are wrong. He wants to carve out a path for himself that doesn't require passing a Latin exam. So he sets a goal. And honestly, when you look at the numbers, it's pretty delusional. He decides he wants to print 50,000 copies in the first issue. 50,000. For context, most school magazines print maybe a few hundred, and he wants to distribute them for free, which means he can't rely on sales revenue, so he needs to do advertising. Specifically, he calculates he needs £8,000 in ad revenue to make this work. Now, £8,000 in 1966 is a lot of money. Adjusted for inflation, that's something like £150,000 or $200,000 today. And he has exactly £4 in his pocket that his mum gave him. Putting those two things together, you can see this is a steep hole Richard's in. On the surface, that doesn't seem like an obvious solution. He's 16, he's a student, he has no office, he's got no track record, he's got no distribution network, and he's trying to convince major multinational companies to give him thousands of pounds to advertise in a magazine that doesn't exist yet. Imagine you're the marketing director at Coca-Cola in 1966, and you get a letter from a teenager at a boarding school asking for a massive ad buy. What are you going to do? I mean, you're going to throw that in the bin immediately. And this is exactly what happens for 2 years. I want to stress this time frame. Richard spends 2 years grinding. And this isn't glamorous entrepreneurship where you're working from a WeWork with an espresso machine or anything. This is Richard Branson hiding in a phone booth at his boarding school. He has to be careful because he's not supposed to even be making business calls. So he's jammed in this tiny booth, dropping coins into the slot, trying to lower his voice to sound like a 40-year-old media mogul instead of a 16-year-old kid whose voice is breaking. He's calling Pepsi. He's calling National Westminster Bank. He's calling Lloyd's. And he's getting rejected over and over and over again. His parents are worried. His teachers are furious because his grades are tanking even further. Everyone thinks that Richard has lost his mind. There's this famous moment at the time, and we alluded to it in the intro. And I love it because it perfectly captures the stakes, where he finally tells his headmaster that he's leaving school at 16 to do this magazine full time. And the headmaster looks at him and he doesn't say, "Good luck, son." He doesn't say, "I believe in you." He says in a stern, upper crust English accent, "Congratulations, Branson. You will either go to prison or become a millionaire." And the way he said it, you and I know he clearly thought prison was the more likely outcome. But Richard, he doesn't quit. And it's at this moment when we see the raw ingredients of the billionaire that Richard becomes. He starts using this incredible blend of hustle and, frankly, a little bit of bluffing. He'll call up Coca-Cola and he'll say, "Oh, well, Pepsi's just taken the back cover. Surely you don't want Pepsi to own that space." And then he'll call up Pepsi and say, "Coca-Cola is looking at the back cover, so you better move fast." In reality, neither of them have bought anything at this point. It's just classic smoke and mirrors. But it works. Slowly, he starts getting yeses. He manages to secure the £8,000. He gets Coca-Cola. He gets the banks. And then he turns his attention to the content Because if you're going to have ads from Coke, you can't just write about school cricket matches. So he wants interviews, but not just any interviews. He wants the biggest cultural icons on the planet. He wants Mick Jagger. He wants John Lennon. Now think about the audacity of this. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles are at the absolute peak of their fame. They're gods. And this kid is pestering their agents, sending telegrams, refusing to go away. And this is the part that blows my mind. They say yes. He gets Mick Jagger to agree to an interview. He gets John Lennon to agree. And there's this hilarious detail in his autobiography that I have to share with you because it just shows how young and naive he actually was. When they get the Mick Jagger interview back, Jagger has given them this quote. He says, "I have no prejudices. I have no feelings. I am merely a physical object." Now, that is a very 1960s avant-garde rock star thing to say. And Richard reads it and he later admits, I can't imagine what we were thinking of when we quoted that. I certainly didn't understand it. So he has no clue what it even means, but he knows it sounds cool, so he prints it. So the first issue of Student launches in January 1968. And it's not just fluff, by the way. They cover the Biafra famine, they cover the Vietnam War, they have original artwork from famous artists like Peter Blake, who did the Sgt. Pepper's cover for the Beatles. It hits the streets, and it works. Within a year, this kid who was failing history and math has £50,000 to his name. So what's the result here? Yes, the magazine was a success. He proved his headmaster wrong, and he proved he wasn't stupid. But if we stop there, we miss the actual takeaway. The magazine itself wasn't a great business long term. It's expensive to print. Distribution was a nightmare. By 1970, it actually folds. But inside the magazine, buried in the back pages, was the seed of the empire. See, Richard notices something. He looks at the letters he's getting from students, and he realizes that while they enjoy the articles, what they really care about is music. But records in the UK were expensive. There was something called retail price maintenance, which is basically a law that said every shop had to sell records at the same price. It was a cartel, effectively. But Richard looked at this and he goes, that's unfair. And this is the takeaway, which is to find a customer pain point, find something that is unfair, and disrupt it. He realizes that while shops had to sell at full price, there was a loophole for mail order. So he puts in a tiny ad at the back of his own magazine. He offers records at a discount, and he says, send us your money, and we'll send you the record. And the response is overwhelming. The cash starts pouring in, literally envelopes stuffed with cash arriving at the church crypt where they were squatting. That little mail order operation, that's not just some side hustle. That is the birth of Virgin Records. So the lesson from this first inflection point isn't just to start a magazine. It's about how you break into a room that you have no business being in. You do it with relentless hustle. You do it by playing the big players off against each other. You do it by telling a story that is bigger than your bank account. Richard didn't have money. He didn't have grades. He didn't have connections. He just had the audacity to pick up the phone and say, this is Richard Branson, and I have an opportunity for you. So now Richard has pivoted. The magazine is fading, but the mail order record business is booming. But there's a problem. He's selling other people's music. He's a middleman, and the margins are tight. Then in 1972, a moment occurs that forces him to stop being just a retailer and become a creator. It involves a shy teenage genius, a haunted manor house, and a piece of music that every single record label in London had thrown in the bin. So let's get into it. Okay, inflection point number 2, and we've moved on to 1972. Virgin mail order is running, but it's brutally hard. And then, just to make things worse, the UK is hit by a national postal strike. So think about that. You run a business that relies entirely on the post office, and the post office shuts down. So Richard, being Richard, pivots again. He opens a physical record shop on Oxford Street. But it's not like a regular shop. It's got beanbags, it's got headphones where you can listen to music for free without buying anything. It's a hangout spot, and it becomes cool. But Richard isn't satisfied with just selling other people's records. He wants to make them. So he does something that makes absolutely no financial sense on paper. He takes a loan from Coutts Bank, which is the Queen's Bank, by the way, and he buys this dilapidated, crumbling 15-bedroom manor house in the countryside, and he calls it the Manor. His vision is that he wants to build the UK's first residential recording studio, a place where bands can live, eat, sleep, and record all in one creative bubble. Now picture this. The studio is barely finished. There's sawdust everywhere. And a band called Arthur Louis is in there recording some tracks. And in the background, sitting in the corner, is this painfully shy, awkward 18-year-old kid. He's the backup guitarist. He barely speaks. He's got long hair. He looks down at his shoes and he seems terrified of the world. His name is Mike Oldfield. One day, after the main band has finished for the night, the studio engineers, Tom Newman and Simon Hayworth, they hear Mike playing this strange, hypnotic melody on the guitar, and they are blown away. So they ask him, "Do you have anything else?" And Mike pulls out this battered demo tape that he recorded on a borrowed machine in his flat in Tottenham. Now, keep in mind at this point, Richard is desperate to launch a record deal. He has the name Virgin Records, he has the distribution, his record shops, but he has no music and he has no artists. And he needs a debut. He needs something that says to the world, we're different. And Mike Oldfield, keep in mind, all he wants is for someone, anyone, to listen to his music that has been living in his head for years. But there's a problem, and it's massive. The engineers play the tape for Richard, and honestly, it's kind of weird. It's a 50-minute long instrumental piece with no lyrics, no drums, no chorus. It's just this long, winding, progressive journey through classical, rock, and folk textures. In 1972, the radio plays 3-minute pop songs. The industry is looking for the next David Bowie or Mark Bolan. They want glam rock. They want hooks. They do not, absolutely not, want a 50-minute track featuring a glockenspiel. Mike Oldfield had actually taken this demo to every single major label in London, EMI, CBS, Warner, and they all said exactly the same thing. This is unmarketable. You can't dance to it. It doesn't even have any words. One exec literally told him, "I wouldn't buy it if you paid me." So Richard is holding this tape, and his own team have doubts. His business partner, Simon Draper, has great ears and he loves it. But commercially, he thinks this is suicide. And then comes the test. Richard takes the demo to a music conference in Cannes, France, trying to license it to a bigger American label. And he finds an exec at Mercury Records who listens to it and says, "I'll give you $20,000 for it." Now, in that moment, $20,000 is a fortune to Richard. He's deep in debt with the Manor Studio and he needs cash. But there's a catch. The exec says, "I'll give you the money, but you have to add vocals, put some singing on it, and we have a deal." So think about the pressure. You're broke. You have a pile of debt. A major American label is waving a check in your face. All you have to do is force this shy kid to sing a few lines. But Mike Oldfield refuses. He says the music is the voice. If you add lyrics, you ruin it. So Richard is standing at the edge of a cliff. Does he take the safe money or compromise the art? Or does he bet the entire future of his new company on a piece of music that every expert says is unsellable? And Richard, he chooses the art. He turns down $20,000. He tells Mike, "We are going to do this ourselves." He gives Mike 1 week of studio time at the Manor, and Mike essentially locks himself in there. He plays almost every single instrument himself. He layers guitars, organs, bells, percussion. He's like a mad scientist in there. And they assign it the catalog number V2001. It's the very first release on Virgin Records. And just to show you how scrappy they were, they couldn't afford marketing. They couldn't afford billboards. So Richard hustles. He finds out that a famous DJ called John Peel, who is a tastemaker of British radio, is the only guy who might play a track this long. Richard badgers him. He gets the record to him, and John listens to it. And John agrees to play it on his show. And on May 25th, 1973, Tubular Bells is released. And that night, John plays side A on his radio show, the whole thing, uninterrupted. He plays 25 minutes of instrumental music on national radio. And at the end of it, he says, "This is one of the most impressive LPs I've ever had the chance to play." The reaction is instant. People stop their cars and they call the station asking, "What was that?" The album starts selling. But then, and this is the lucky break that every entrepreneur needs, a director called William Friedkin is looking for a soundtrack for his new horror movie. That movie is The Exorcist. He hears Tubular Bells. He thinks the spooky, repetitive piano intro is perfect, and he puts it in the movie. The Exorcist becomes a global phenomenon. And suddenly, this weird instrumental album by a shy kid from Tottenham is the most famous piece of music in the world. And it stays on the UK charts for 279 weeks. That is 5 years. It sells millions of copies and it makes Virgin Records millions of pounds. So look at the strategic thinking here. If Richard had listened to the experts, he would have demanded vocals and the album would have been a total flop. If he had taken the $20,000 from Mercury, he would have paid off his debts, but he would have lost the asset. Instead, Richard trusted the product. He trusted that if something is truly, radically unique, it doesn't need to fit the mold. So this victory does two things for Richard. The first is that it gives him cash. Tubular Bells literally bankrolls the entire Virgin Empire for the next decade. It pays for the Sex Pistols, it pays for Culture Club, it pays for the first jumbo jet. But two, and this is more important, it cements the Virgin brand DNA. Virgin becomes the place for the outsiders, the misfits, because if they can make a hit out of a 50-minute Bell Symphony, they can make a hit out of anything. It gave Richard the confidence to say, I do not care what the industry says, I trust my gut. So now Richard has money, he has a successful record label, he's the king of cool in London. Life is good. He could just sit back, sign bands, and party on his houseboat. But 10 years later, in 1984, he makes a decision that makes absolutely everyone, his partners, his bankers, his friends, think he's finally lost his mind. He decides to take on the most regulated, capital-intensive, cutthroat industry on the planet, and it all starts with a chalkboard in a Puerto Rican airport. All right, inflection point number 3 now, and this story is legendary, but almost everyone gets the most important detail wrong. They think Richard Branson started an airline because he had some big strategic plan or because he had a team of consultants who told him aviation was a high growth sector. He didn't. He started an airline because he was stuck in an airport and he wanted to see his girlfriend. It's 1984. Richard is 34 years old. He's successful. He's famous. Virgin Records is printing money. And he is deeply in love with a woman named Joan, who thankfully for this story is waiting for him in the British Virgin Islands. Richard's in Puerto Rico. He's got his bags packed and he's ready to go. And then the announcement comes over the PA system. Flight cancelled. American Airlines just cancels the flight because they didn't have enough passengers to make it profitable, so they just scrubbed it. Now, look around the terminal. What do you think most people do in this situation? They get angry, they shout at the desk agent, and they probably go find a bar and complain. They accept that they are victims of the system. But Richard doesn't do that. And this is the reflex that separates him from 99.9% of the population. He looks at this problem, I'm stuck here in this airport where I don't want to be, and he immediately reframes it. He wanders off to the back of the airport and finds a charter company. He asks, how much to charter a plane to the BVI right now? The guy says, $2,000. Now, Richard doesn't have $2,000 in cash on him to just throw away, but he does the math in his head. He looks at the number of stranded passengers in the terminal. He divides $2,000 by the number of seats on the plane, and he realizes, if I can sell these seats for $39 each, I cover my costs. So getting inside Richard's head for a moment, yes, he wants to see Joan and the BVI, but there's a deeper desire kicking in here. He's furious at the way that airlines treat him and everyone else, like cargo, like cattle, and he wants to prove that it doesn't have to be this way. So he does something that is pure, unfiltered Richard Branson. He finds a blackboard, just a dusty old chalkboard, and he writes on it, Virgin Airways, $39, single flight to BVI. So he walks into the terminal, holding this blackboard above his head, and he starts shouting, who wants to go to BVI tonight? And people buy tickets. They pay him in cash. So Richard collects the money, pays the charter pilot, and they all pile onto this plane. And as they land in the BVI, one of the passengers turns to him and says, casually, just a throwaway comment, sharpen up the service a bit, and you could be in business. Now, most people would have a great story for the dinner party and leave it at that. But Richard goes back to London and he can't shake this experience. He starts thinking, why are airlines so terrible? Why is the food so awful? Why are the staff rude? And why is there no entertainment? So all of a sudden, this is what makes him want to start a transatlantic airline. And this is where the real challenge starts, because this is arguably the stupidest business decision a record label owner could ever make. His partners at Virgin Records go absolutely mental. Simon Draper, his closest ally, basically says, Richard, are you insane? We're a music company. We know nothing about planes. Airlines lose money. They go bankrupt. This will destroy us. And he's right. The aviation industry in the 80s is a graveyard. You have giants like Pan Am and TWA. You have British Airways, which is essentially a government-backed monopoly. And there's also the ghost of Freddie Laker. Sir Freddie Laker was a hero of Richard's. He started Laker Airways, the SkyTrain, to offer cheap flights, and British Airways and the others conspired to crush him. They lowered prices to drive him out of business, then they raised them again, and Laker went bankrupt in 1982. So everyone tells Richard, they're going to do exactly the same thing to you. You're walking into a slaughterhouse. But Richard, he just sees it differently. He calls up Freddie Laker, and Laker gives him the most important piece of advice he ever receives. He says, Richard, they're going to try to kill you, but you have one advantage that I didn't have. You have the Virgin brand. You have your personality. You have to use yourself. Make yourself the clown. Make yourself the news. Get on the front page of every newspaper because you can't outspend British Airways on advertising. That advice changes everything. It gives Richard permission to be a stuntman CEO. But at the same time, there's still a huge financial risk. How do you start an airline without bankrupting your record company? And this is the moment that's pure genius, and it's a masterclass in downside protection. Richard flies to Seattle to meet with Boeing. He wants a 747, it's a jumbo jet. Now, nobody leases a single 747 to a guy who runs a record shop. It's unheard of. But Richard negotiates like his life depends on it. He tells Boeing, I'm going to take this plane, but I need an escape clause. If the airline doesn't work out after 12 months, I can give the plane back, and I'm only liable for the first year's lease. And Boeing agrees to this because the aviation market at the time is at a weak spot, and they have planes just sitting on the tarmac doing nothing. So think about what Richard just did. He capped his downside. He goes back to his terrified partners at Virgin Records and says, guys, listen, the worst case scenario, the absolute apocalypse, is that we lose 1 year of profits. That's it. We won't go bankrupt. We just have a bad year. But if it works, we build a global brand. Because he protected the downside, his partners let him do it. So on June 22nd, 1984, the inaugural Virgin Atlantic flight takes off from Gatwick to Newark. And it's chaos. It's absolutely filled with celebrities, journalists, and party people. Richard is popping champagne. There's a magician on board. It's like a nightclub in the skies. But the important thing here is that this isn't just some wild party with celebrities. It's a fundamentally better product. He introduces what he calls upper class, which is first class service at business class prices. He gives people ice cream at the movies. He puts little salt and pepper shakers shaped like airplanes on the trays, which people steal by the thousands, by the way. And he loves it because it's free marketing and it works. Virgin Atlantic doesn't just survive, it becomes cool and it forces British Airways to wake up. But the real result here is psychological because this moment proves to Richard that his skills are transferable. He realizes, I don't need to know how to fix a jet engine. I just need to know how to build a team and I just need to know how to protect the downside. This is the moment that Richard Branson stops being just a music guy and becomes a venture capitalist of brands. Because without that cancelled flight in Puerto Rico, there's no Virgin Mobile, there's no Virgin Money, there's no Virgin Galactic. It all comes back to that chalkboard that Richard raised above his head, telling people to fly with him to the BVI. So, Virgin Atlantic is flying high, the customers love it, the press loves it, but there's someone who absolutely does not love it. British Airways. They've been watching this upstart with the beard and the sweater, and they've decided enough is enough. They aren't just going to compete with them. They are going to destroy them. And what follows is one of the darkest, dirtiest chapters in corporate history. All right, let's talk about something that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a spy novel. If you weren't around in the early 90s, you might think I'm exaggerating this next part. I promise you I'm not. This is the moment where business stopped being just friendly competition for Richard Branson and turned into actual warfare. It's 1990. Virgin Atlantic has been flying for 6 years, and against all odds, it's actually working. But British Airways, this massive government-backed giant, is not happy. They control Heathrow. They control the transatlantic routes. And for years, they looked at Virgin like a mosquito. Annoying, but harmless. But then, two things happen that change everything. First, Virgin starts getting landing slots at Heathrow. That is BA's fortress. Suddenly, the mosquito is inside the house. And second, during the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, Richard does something incredibly bold. He flies a Virgin plane straight into Baghdad to rescue British hostages. He gets them out. It's this massive, heroic PR moment, and the world sees him as a hero. And Lord King, the chairman of British Airways, he decides he's had enough. He allegedly calls the CEO, Colin Marshall, and gives him a simple order: do something about Branson. And thus begins what they called internally Operation Barbara. The reason for this code name is that it's named after Barbara Cartland, the romance novelist. Because, and this is a direct quote from Inside BA, and so pardon my language in advance, she wrote a lot of novels about virgins getting screwed. That is the level of cynicism that we're dealing with here. So what does Richard think about all this? It's worth getting into his head for a moment. All he wants is a fair fight. He believes that if he offers better service, free limos for upper class passengers, seatback TVs, that customers are going to choose him. He wants the market to decide. But British Airways, they want him dead. They don't want to just beat him. They want to bankrupt him because they view Virgin as an existential threat to their monopoly. So they launch a campaign of dirty tricks that is honestly hard to believe. So BA set up this secret unit, a department of dirty tricks. They illegally access Virgin's computer systems. They hack into the reservation data. They get the names and phone numbers of Virgin passengers. And then, this is the crazy part, BA employees call those passengers. They pretend to be from Virgin Atlantic and they say, I'm so sorry, your flight has been cancelled due to maintenance issues. But don't worry, we can rebook you on British Airways right now. So they are literally stealing passengers by lying to them. But it gets worse. They hire private investigators to dig through Richard's garbage bins outside his house looking for dirt. They start spreading rumors to financial journalists that Virgin is insolvent. They whisper that Richard is broke. They try to spook the banks, so they'll pull Virgin's credit lines. And it starts working. Virgin's bookings drop. Richard is losing millions, and he doesn't know why. He's confused. He's paranoid, and he feels like he's going crazy. Think about it. If you were in Richard's shoes, you'd be confused, paranoid, like truly losing your mind. But then he gets a break. A whistleblower from inside BA contacts him, and then another. They bring him evidence, computer logs, memos. So now Richard realizes, I'm not crazy. They're actually coming for me. But here's the issue. Richard is David, and BA is Goliath. BA has endless money. They have the best lawyers in London. They have the establishment on their side, and Lord King is peer of the realm. If Richard sues them and loses, the legal fees alone will bankrupt Virgin, and he'll be finished. His advisors tell him, don't do it. You can't win against BA. Just keep your head down. And for regular listeners of Inflection Moments, this sounds very similar to that lawsuit that James Dyson faced when he had that patent infringement lawsuit against Hoover. But this is the moment when you start to see what Richard is really made of. Richard decides he cannot live in a world where bullies win. So he gathers his team and says, we're going to fight them. In December 1992, he sues British Airways for libel. BA countersues immediately. They use their massive PR machine to paint Richard as a publicity seeker, and they say his claims are baseless and defamatory. It looks like it's going to be a long, drawn-out war of attrition that Virgin can't afford. But as the court date approaches in January 1993, something shifts. Richard's lawyers start disclosing their evidence, and it's overwhelming. The paper trail is undeniable. The hacking, the shredding of documents, the lies. BA's lawyers look at the evidence and they realize, oh my God, we're going to lose, and we're going to lose publicly. So at the 11th hour, just before the trial's about to start, BA surrenders, and it's a total capitulation. They agree to pay Richard £500,000 in personal damages, the highest liable payment in British history at the time. They pay Virgin Atlantic £110,000 in damages for a total of £610,000, and they pay £3 million in legal costs. And most importantly, they're forced to issue a public, unreserved apology in the High Court. They have to admit they lied. But that is not the end of the story, because the next part is what separates Richard as an extraordinary business leader. What do you think Richard does with this victory? He doesn't just pocket it himself. Instead, he does something that's a masterclass in culture building. He takes that £500,000, the money that was meant for him personally, and he splits it equally among his staff. He calls it the BA Christmas bonus. Every single Virgin employee gets a check paid for by British Airways. You cannot buy that kind of morale. But the even bigger result is what happens to the brand. Before this war, Virgin was just a challenger. But after this war, Virgin is the people's champion, and the public love a giant killer. They love seeing the little guy stand up to the bully and win. And this victory cements Virgin's positioning for the next 30 years. It gives them a moral authority that money can't buy. When they launch Virgin Mobile or Virgin Money and Virgin Trains, the public thinks, these are the good guys. These are the guys who fight for us. BA's chairman, Lord King, he resigns in disgrace. BA's reputation is all over the place. And from all of this, Richard lands that sometimes the biggest risks, they aren't financial, they're moral. And if you stand your ground when you know you're right, the market rewards you. So Richard won the war and he saved the airline. But victories in business often come with a hidden cost. This war with BA totally drained Virgin's cash reserves. The economy in the early 90s is tanking, and suddenly Richard is facing a liquidity crisis that no amount of PR can fix. He needs money, a lot of money, and to get it, he's going to have to make the most painful decision of his entire life. He's going to have to sell his baby. Okay, this is the big one. If the previous story was about external warfare, fighting BA, this story is about internal warfare. It's about the battle between your head and your heart. And honestly, I think this is the single most impressive decision that Richard Branson has ever made. It's 1992, and on the surface, everything looks great. Virgin is a household name, and Richard is a celebrity. But underneath, the house is burning down. The airline war with BA had drained everything. The global economy is in a recession, oil prices are spiking because of the Gulf War, and Virgin Atlantic is bleeding cash. And the banks, who have always been nervous about Richard's chaotic empire, are getting spooked, and they're threatening to pull his overdraft facilities. If they do that, Virgin Atlantic collapses overnight. The planes are grounded, thousands of people lose their jobs, and the dream is over. So Richard is frantic. He's running around London, meeting with investors, trying to find cash. But no one wants to lend money to an airline in a recession. So then, out of nowhere, a lifeline appears. Thorn EMI, a massive British entertainment conglomerate, approaches Richard. They want to buy Virgin Music. Now you have to understand what Virgin Music means to Richard. This isn't just an asset. This is the company he started in a church crypt when he was a teenager. This is the company that released Tubular Bells. It's the company that signed the Sex Pistols when nobody else would touch them. This is the company that had signed Janet Jackson and the Rolling Stones. It's his first love. It's his identity. He literally refers to it as his child. So naturally, if you're Richard, you do anything to keep it. But the math simply doesn't work. Richard doesn't have the liquidity to manage both the music business and the airline. So Thorn EMI puts an offer on the table. £510 million. It's about $1 billion in today's money. It's a staggering amount of money. It's enough to pay off all the debts. It's enough to make him personally one of the richest men in Britain. But the emotional cost is devastating. Imagine being asked to sell your firstborn child to save your secondborn child. That is how he feels. His partners are split. His music team, the people who've been with him since the beginning, are heartbroken. They're begging him not to sell. They say, Richard, we are a music company. Why are we selling the profitable business to save the airline that's losing money? It makes no sense. And logic is on their side. Why sell the cash cow to save the problem child? So Richard is torn apart over this. He's sleepless. He's anxious. He knows that if he signs that contract, he's no longer the cool indie guy record label. He just becomes another businessman. But he also knows that if he doesn't sell, the airline dies. And if the airline dies, British Airways wins, The bullies win. So he makes the decision. He decides to sell, but listen to how he frames it because it's key. He tells his team, Virgin Atlantic is the child that is being bullied in the playground. I have to protect the child that's being bullied. He reframes the sale not as an abandonment of music, but as a rescue mission for the airline. So he signs a deal in June of 92. And during this time, there's this image that really sticks with me. Deal's done. He has this check for £500 million in his pocket. He's now officially a tycoon. And he runs out of the lawyer's office, down the street in London, and he passes a newsstand. And the headline on the Evening Standard says, Richard sells for £1 billion. It should be this massive moment of triumph. But listen to how Richard describes this moment. In his own words, he says, I remember running down the street with tears streaming down my face. I just sold my family. But look at what happened next. That money saved Virgin Atlantic. It allowed them to upgrade the fleet. It allowed them to expand routes, and it allowed them to survive the 90s and become a global icon. But more importantly, it freed Richard. It gave him the capital to stop worrying about survival and start thinking about the future. Because of that sale, he had the money to start Virgin Mobile. He had the money to start Virgin Trains. He had the money to dream up Virgin Galactic and start building spaceships, for God's sake. If he'd held onto the record label, he might still just be a music exec today. Instead, he became a global entrepreneur who's trying to send people to Mars. And here's the kicker. A few years later, he started a new record label, V2. So he got back into music anyway. The takeaway here is profound. Sometimes you have to kill something you love to save the bigger vision. It's the hardest thing a founder will ever do. But Richard showed that if you have the courage to make the brutal call, the other side of that pain is total freedom. So those are Richard's 5 inflection points. But I think what's more important here is to go deeper than this. We need to think about what this all means for you and I. So let's put it all together and look at the common threads, the playbook that you can actually use in your own business. So we've walked through 5 pivotal moments in Richard Branson's life. And when you look at them individually, they look like pure chaos. I mean, what does a magazine have to do with the record label? What does a record label have to do with an airline? What does an airline have to do with space travel? On the surface, it just looks like he's throwing spaghetti at the wall. But when you look at the building blocks of his decision making, you see a pattern, you see a code. When you look at this, I think there are 3 big themes that cut across every single one of these inflection points. And these are the specific tools that you can take away and use in your own business. The first common thread is to protect the downside and attack the upside. This is the most misunderstood thing about Richard Branson. People see him kite surfing with some model on his back or flying a hot air balloon and they think, oh, he's a gambler, he loves risk taking. But he's not a gambler. He is the exact opposite. He is obsessed with mitigating risk. His father taught him this when he was 15. He said, before you take any risk, figure out the maximum you can lose. If you can survive the downside, then, and only then, do you attack the upside. Look at the evidence we've just covered. With Virgin Atlantic, he didn't just buy a fleet of planes, he leased one plane with an escape clause that allowed him to give it back after 12 months. The downside, I mean, that's just 1 year of profits. It's survivable. The upside, you're building a global airline. It's unlimited. Think about this with Tubular Bells. He didn't sign Mike Oldfield to some $1 million contract. He gave him 1 week of studio time in a studio he already owned. The downside is a wasted week. There's no cost with that. The upside is a hit record that funded the empire. Too many founders think that taking a risk means betting the farm. It doesn't. It means structuring the bet so that if you lose, you don't die. And if you win big. It's all about structuring risk asymmetrically. The second common thread about Richard's story is to find the customer pain point, then obsess over it. This is hardly a revolutionary common thread, but I think it's incredibly valuable all the same. Richard never enters an industry because he's an expert in it. He knew nothing about publishing. He knew nothing about music distribution. He knew nothing about jet engines. He enters an industry because he is a frustrated customer. He looks for sectors where the incumbents are lazy, where the service is terrible, where the customer is being treated like an annoyance rather than a guest. With Student Magazine, he was frustrated that school news was boring. With Virgin Records, he was frustrated that record stores were sterile and expensive. With Virgin Atlantic, he was frustrated that flying was miserable. He finds the pain, and then, this is key, he doesn't just fix it, he makes it fun. He realizes that if you can take some mundane experience, like buying a record or sitting on a plane, and you sprinkle a bit of magic on it, you create loyalty that is irrational. And by the way, this explains why he also sometimes fails. I mean, look at Virgin Cola. We haven't had time to talk about that on this episode, but it's worth exploring why it failed. The reason why it failed is because Coke doesn't taste bad. Coke doesn't treat its customers badly. There was no pain point. He was just launching a Me Too product. And without a genuine customer pain to solve, the Virgin brand doesn't work. And the third common thread with Richard is to delegate everything except the big picture. And honestly, this might be the most important one. It goes back to the dyslexia. Because Richard couldn't read well, because he couldn't do spreadsheets, because he couldn't manage the minutiae, he was forced to delegate. Most founders hold on to control for too long. They want to do the marketing, the product, the hiring. They become the bottleneck. Richard couldn't be the bottleneck because literally he couldn't do the work. So from day one, when Richard was just 16 years old, he had to find a Nick Powell. He had to find a Simon Draper. He had to find people who were better than him at the details. This turned him into something really rare, a pure visionary. Richard is the ringmaster, not the performer. His job is not to run a company. His job is to dream up the next one, to tell the story, and to protect the brand. And because he built Virgin this way, as a decentralized network of companies run by other people, it allows him to scale infinitely. That is how you get to 400 companies under your umbrella. You can't do that if you're micromanaging. So that's the playbook. Cap your downside, follow the frustration, and fire yourself from the details. If you can do those three things, you're not just building a business, you're building the life of an entrepreneur at the highest level. And I think that's why us entrepreneurs love Richard Branson. Not because he's super successful, but because he shows us that business doesn't have to be boring. It can be an adventure. It can be a fight against the bullies, and it can be a hell of a lot of fun. Okay, wrapping things up, I just want to leave you with one final thought. There's a moment in Richard Branson's life that we didn't cover today, but I think it perfectly sums up everything that we've just talked about. It was 1999. Virgin had just launched Virgin Mobile. Now think about the mobile phone industry in the late 90s. It was boring. It was bureaucratic. It was confusing contracts and hidden fees. It was exactly the kind of industry that Richard hates. So for the launch, Richard decides to do a stunt. He drives a tank, a literal military tank, into Times Square in New York, and he crushes a pile of cars that have high fees painted on them. It was ridiculous. It was loud. I mean, the police were there and the media went crazy. But here's the thing. Richard Branson was almost 50 years old when he did that. Most people, by the time they hit 50, they slow down. They get cynical and they stop taking risks. They start protecting what they have instead of building what could be. But Richard, he was still the 16-year-old kid in the phone booth. He's still that 20-year-old in the customs office, and he's still the guy holding the chalkboard in Puerto Rico. He never lost that hustle. He never lost his playfulness, and he never stopped asking, why can't this be better? And that is my challenge to you. You might not be launching an airline. You might not be buying a private island, but somewhere in your business right now, there's a British Airways. There's a bully. There's a system that's broken. There's a customer who's frustrated, and you have a choice. You can accept it, or you can grab a chalkboard and write your own rules and build something better. That is what Richard Branson's story can teach us. I'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on Inflection Moments. If today's story sparked a new perspective or challenged your thinking, be sure to share it with someone you know loves this stuff as much as you and I do. Maybe it's a college buddy, your water cooler buddy, or maybe even someone in the family group chat. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to our channels so you can be the first one to hear what we've got coming next. And if you're interested in insights, ideas, and lessons from some of the world's greatest entrepreneurs, sign up for our newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, keep building and talk soon.